The whole field had gone gray, shimmering, alive. Wings beat against the morning like a low thunder that never broke. Adeline stood at the fence with her apron full of seed she had forgotten she was holding, watching 10,000 birds settle over the cabbages, and her husband whispered the only sensible thing left to say, we're finished. 2 months earlier, in the cool of April planting, old Hetty Vance leaned on the fence and watched Adeline press bean seeds into the dirt. "You read the land too much like a book," Hetty said. "Trouble is, the land don't always say what it means. You got to watch what it does, not what folks say it ought to." Adeline laughed and brushed her hands. The words sank somewhere quiet. She would not understand them until the summer turned everything against her. The homestead sat on a low rise above Spring Creek in the dry country east of the mountains, where the wind carried more dust than rain. Adeline and Caleb Mercer had been 3 years on the land, 3 years of breaking sod and hauling water, and patching a cabin roof that complained at every storm. They were not rich. They had never expected to be. What they had was a half-acre garden that Adeline tended like a third member of the household, and that garden was the difference between a winter spent eating and a winter spent owing. Caleb worked the wider fields, wheat that came up thin, oats that came up thinner. But the garden was Adeline's domain, and she kept it with a stubborn precision that the neighbors found peculiar. She rotated her cabbages and her beans. She buried fish heads beneath the corn. She watched the sky and the soil and the small green lives that pushed up from it, and she kept a little book of notes that Caleb teased her for, pages full of dates and weather, and which row did poorly and why. Their neighbors were good people and certain people, which is not always the same thing. The Pruitts to the south farmed the way their fathers had. The Callaways to the east did the same. When something went wrong, they all knew the cause. And when something went right, they knew that too, and they were not shy about telling the Mercers how a thing ought to be done. Adeline had learned to nod and to go on doing as she pleased. That summer arrived hot and early. By June, the creek had shrunk to a trickle, and the dust lay thick on every leaf. The wheat browned at the edges. Worse, an unease had crept into the valley, a quiet wrongness that Adeline felt before she could name it. The cabbages showed small holes. The bean leaves looked lace-edged some mornings. When she knelt close, she found them. Tiny worms curled in the hearts of the plants, beetles no bigger than a seed, pale grubs working through the soil. Every farm in the valley had them. Nobody spoke of it much, the way people don't speak of a thing they fear they cannot stop. Adeline spoke of it in her book. She wrote down what she saw and waited, because waiting and watching were the only tools she trusted. And because Hetty Vance had once told her the land does not always say what it means. The birds came on a Tuesday. Adeline was carrying seed to the chicken yard when she heard it, a sound like wind that had decided to have weight. She looked east and saw the sky darkening at the edge, not with cloud but with motion, a long ribbon of gray that bent and folded and poured itself down out of the morning. Pigeons. Wild ones. The great traveling kind her grandfather had told stories of. Flocks that could blot the sun for an hour. They came down into her garden, not over it, into it, settling onto the cabbages and the bean rows and the green corn until every leaf bore a bird, and the whole half-acre rippled and churned and cried out with 10,000 throats. Caleb came running from the barn, his face white. Adeline stood at the fence with her apron full of forgotten seed, and the world had gone gray. "We're finished," Caleb said again, and reached for the long pole that leaned against the fence, the one they used to knock apples from the high branches. "Help me drive them off before they strip it bare." Adeline put a hand on his arm. "Wait. Wait for what?" "Addie, that's our winter sitting under all those birds. Look at them." She was looking. That was the trouble. She was looking harder than she ever had, because something in the way the birds moved did not match the dread in her chest. A flock come to ruin a field tears at it. She had seen sparrows do it, seen crows. They pulled and gulped and fought. These birds were not pulling at the leaves. They were walking the rows, heads bobbing low, working at something close to the soil and along the stems. "They're not eating the cabbages," she said slowly. "They're sitting on the cabbages. That's near enough to eating them." By now the neighbors had heard the noise. Mr. Pruitt came up the lane on his mule, and behind him two of the Calloway boys, and they ranged along the fence shouting and waving their hats. "Drive 'em, Caleb! Drive 'em now! They'll have nothing left by noon." Pruitt's voice cracked with the certainty of a man watching his own fears wear someone else's face. Caleb lifted the pole. Adeline did not let go of his arm. "Give me till noon," she said. "Just till noon. If they're stripping it, we drive them, and I'll help you do it myself. But look first. Caleb, look at what they're doing." She climbed the fence. The neighbors shouted at her to come back. She walked into the flock, and the birds parted around her skirts and closed again behind her, unbothered, intent on their work. She knelt in the bean row, ignoring the storm of wings, and she watched a single pigeon at her feet. It dipped its head to a leaf she knew was riddled with worms. It came up with a worm in its beak. It dipped again. A beetle, again. A pale grub plucked from the turned earth. Her heart did something complicated. She picked the leaf the bird had just cleaned and held it up. The holes were old holes. There were no new ones. There was no worm left in the heart of it. "Caleb," she called over the din, and her voice was strange even to her. "Put down the pole. Put it down and come see. I don't think they came to take our supper. I think they came to save it." Caleb did not put down the pole right away. He stood at the fence with Pruitt and the Calloway boys yelling behind him, caught between the certainty of his neighbors and the steadiness in his wife's voice. Then he set the pole against the rail and climbed over. He knelt beside her in the churning gray. He watched the bird at her feet take a grub, a beetle, a worm. He picked up a cabbage leaf and turned it in his rough fingers and found it clean of everything but the old scars. He stood, and he faced the fence, and he said the words that turned them, that summer, into the strangest family in the valley. "We're letting them stay," he said. "Go on home. We're letting them stay." That evening, Hetty Vance walked up from her place along the creek, slow on her cane, and stood at the fence where the others had stood. But she did not shout. She watched the birds a long while in the failing light. "Folks'll tell you you're fools," she said at last. "They already have," said Adeline. The old woman smiled, her face folding into all its lines. "I told you once the land don't say what it means. You listened. That's rarer than you know, child." She tapped her cane against the rail. "I'll come by. Somebody ought to watch this with you who isn't certain you're wrong." The flock did not leave at dusk, and it did not leave the next day. It moved. That was the thing Adeline came to understand in those first strange days. A flock that size could not sit still without harming what it sat on. The weight alone would have crushed the rows flat if the birds had roosted in one place too long. But they were restless by nature, traveling creatures, and they rose and shifted and resettled in waves all day long, working one corner of the garden and then lifting in a great rush to fall on another. The garden breathed with them, gray and then green and then gray again. Adeline studied this rhythm the way she studied everything, and on the second morning she had an idea that made Caleb look at her sideways. If the birds moved on their own, she said, then perhaps they could be encouraged to move where she wanted, when she wanted, steered through the rows like water through a ditch, so that no part of the garden bore them too long and every part got cleaned. "Steer them," Caleb repeated. "Addie, you're talking about herding wild pigeons. I'm talking about giving them reasons to walk the way I'd walk them." She started with water. The creek was low, and the dust was everywhere, and a thirsty bird will go where the water is. So she and Caleb dug out a dozen shallow pans, old pie tins, a cracked wash basin, the bottom half of a butter churn, and set them along the garden's edges and down the center path. They filled them each morning from the rain barrel. By the third day, the pigeons had found them, and Adeline watched with quiet satisfaction as the flock learned to drift toward the pans, drink, and then settle into the nearest rows to feed. Then came the grain she had read once, or perhaps Hetty had told her, she could no longer remember. That you cannot drive a thing half so well as you can lead it. So instead of chasing the birds from a row she wanted to rest, she laid a thin trail of cracked corn leading away from it, into the row she wanted worked next. The birds followed the corn, like children following a fiddler, and where they walked they worked. And the corn was so little and so scattered that it cost almost nothing and was gone into their crops within the hour. It became a kind of dance, those long hot days. Adeline would rise before light and study the garden. Which rows showed fresh damage, which had been cleaned, where the worms were thickest in the cool dawn soil. Then she would set her water and lay her grain trails, and through the day she would tend them, refilling, rescattering, nudging the great gray tide this way and that. Caleb learned it alongside her. He who had reached for the pole that first morning now moved through the flock with a gentleness that surprised them both, murmuring to the birds, stepping careful among them, his big hands trailing corn. The neighbors did not understand it. They came by, some of them, and stood at the fence and shook their heads. Pruitt declared that the Mercers had lost their reason. The Calloway boys made a joke of it and called Caleb the Pigeon King, and the name traveled, and for a while it was not a kind name. At the church social, a woman asked Adeline, with the particular sweetness of someone enjoying another's folly, whether she had taken to farming birds instead of beans. Adeline smiled and said she was farming both, and let the woman make of that what she would. But Hetty came as she had promised. She came most evenings, slow on her cane, and she sat on an upturned crate at the garden's edge and watched the birds work in the long gold light. She did not say much. Now and then she pointed with her cane at something Adeline had missed. A corner gone too long without birds, a pan run dry. Once she said, "My grandmother told of flocks like this," said they followed the bugs. Said the old people knew to be glad of them, and the new people only knew to be afraid. Then she said nothing more for an hour, and that was company enough. In the evenings, Adeline wrote in her book. She wrote the date and the weather, and where the worms were thick and where they were gone. She wrote how many pans and where, how much corn and along which rows. She wrote that the bean leaves showing fresh holes had dropped from near every leaf to scarcely 1 in 20. She wrote, on the 9th night, in a hand that shook a little, with something she would not yet call hope. The garden is greener than it was before they came. It was true, and it went on being true, and that was the wonder of it. Across the valley, the worms and beetles and grubs had not gone anywhere. They had only multiplied in the hot, dry weather, the way such things do when nothing comes to check them. On the Pruitt place, the cabbages began to fail first. The great green heads softening, holed through, the hearts of them gone to rot and writhing. The Callaway corn, which had stood so proud in June, browned and bent, its ears light and worm-bored when they pulled the husks. Up and down Spring Creek, the gardens that everyone had tended the proper way, the certain way, were quietly coming apart from the inside, and the Mercer garden stood green. Not perfect. Adeline would never have claimed perfect. There were leaves the birds had bruised in their landing, stalks bent by 10,000 small feet. But the plants were whole and growing, the cabbages firming into tight pale hearts, the beans hanging heavy and clean, the corn pushing up its silk. Where every other garden in the valley was being eaten alive, hers was thriving. And the only difference any honest eye could find was the gray flock that rose and fell across it like a living tide. She came to know the birds in a way she had not expected. Not as individuals, there were far too many for that, but as a single great creature with moods and habits she could read. She knew the sound the flock made when it was content, a low rolling murmur like water over stones. She knew the sharper note that ran through it when a hawk crossed the sky, and she learned to look up when she heard it, and twice she saw the whole flock lift in one breathless instant and wheel away and come pouring back when the danger passed. She knew they fed hardest in the cool of morning and the cool of evening, and grew lazy in the noon heat, and she set her grain trails to match. Caleb took to it more deeply than she had. He had been a quiet man, made quieter by 3 hard years, and something in the daily tending of the flock loosened him. She would find him at the fence at dusk just watching, his work done, a half-smile on his weathered face. They came 1,000 miles, maybe, he said one evening, from somewhere up north, going somewhere down south, and they stopped here. Of all the fields in all this country, they stopped in ours. He shook his head. Feels like being chosen for something. Feels like luck, said Adeline, who did not entirely believe it was luck, and did not entirely believe it wasn't. The work was not without its troubles. The pans had to be filled twice a day now, for the creek dropped lower and the heat climbed higher, and hauling water was Caleb's labor before dawn and after dark. The corn cost more than she'd hoped, for the flock learned the trick of it and grew bold, and once they cleaned out a whole sack in a morning, and Adeline had to ration what was left. There were mornings the birds did not want to go where she led them, when the worms were thicker somewhere she didn't want them, and the flock would not be coaxed away until they'd had their fill. She learned then that she was not their master, she was their neighbor. She could offer and invite and arrange, but she could not command, and there was a humility in that which she came, slowly, to like. Hetty named it for her one evening. They sat watching the birds settle for the night in the cottonwoods along the creek, a great gray weight bending the branches. You ever notice, Hetty said, how the folks who farm by the book always end up fighting the land? Fighting the bugs, fighting the weather, fighting the birds, wearing themselves to the bone against it. She worked her jaw. And here you are, not fighting a thing, just paying attention, just asking what wants to happen and helping it along. She nodded, satisfied. That's the older way, the truer way. Most folks forgot it. Adeline turned the words over a long time after the old woman had gone home. Asking what wants to happen. She thought of the worms and the beetles, of the birds that ate them, of the long migration that had set 10,000 hungry mouths down in her field at the precise hour she needed them most. None of it was hers. She had made none of it. She had only watched and waited and been willing to be wrong about what she saw. In her book that night, she wrote, 3 weeks, the garden has never looked so well. I begin to think we will eat this winter after all. She should not have written it down. Some part of her, frontier-raised and superstitious, knew better. It was Caleb, 2 days later, who put it into words that turned hope into something fiercer. He came up from the lower field at noon, hat in hand, and stood looking out over the green half-acre and the gray birds working it. Behind him, beyond the fence line, the Pruitt garden showed brown and dying. Addie, he said, it's not just that we'll get by. Do you see? We'll be the only ones. She did see it. She had been seeing it, and not letting herself say it. By autumn theirs might be the only garden in the whole valley that came through, the only winter food, the only seed for spring, while every certain neighbor who had laughed at the Pigeon King watched their proper rows turn to rot. They were not surviving. They were winning. But a man does not like to be wrong, and a valley does not like to be saved by a thing it does not understand. The trouble began, as trouble in that country often did, with talk. It started small, at the mill, at the church, at the store where the women traded eggs for thread. The Mercers and their birds became the subject that filled the silences. At first, it was only mockery, the Pigeon King and his crazy wife. But as the other gardens failed, and the Mercer garden did not, the mockery curdled into something else. People do not easily forgive a neighbor for being right when they have been wrong, and they forgive it least of all when their own children's winter is the price of the error. Pruitt was the loudest. He had lost his cabbages entire, and his temper with them. He took to saying, where it would get back to the Mercers, that there was something unnatural about that garden, that no honest farming made beans grow where every other bean in the valley had failed, that a flock of wild birds did not just happen to settle and stay and behave like trained dogs unless someone or something had arranged it. He did not quite say. Witchcraft. He was too careful a man for that. But he let the words stand just off stage, and others, frightened and hungry and ashamed, were willing enough to bring it on. Adeline felt the chill of it at the store one Saturday, when conversation stopped as she came in and started again, lower, as she gathered her thread. She felt it when the Calloway boys, who had only been teasing before, would no longer meet Caleb's eye. She felt it most in the small cruelties. A gate left open so a calf wandered, a row of her melons trampled in the night by someone who left boot prints and no apology. They're afraid, Hetty told her. Afraid and hungry, and looking for a reason that isn't their own stubbornness. You're the easiest reason to hand. The old woman's mouth was grim. It'll get worse before harvest. Mind yourself. It got worse. The birds themselves grew uneasy as the weeks wore on. They were migrating creatures, after all, and some old clock in them was beginning to turn toward the journey south. Adeline noticed it first in the mornings. A restlessness, a tendency to lift and circle and not come down so readily. A thinning at the edges of the flock as small groups peeled away to follow the season. The great gray tide that had covered her garden was, almost imperceptibly, beginning to ebb. She said nothing to Caleb at first. She told herself it was nothing, but she wrote it in her book, and the writing made it real. Flock smaller this morning. They feel the season turning. If the birds left before the worms were beaten, before the harvest was safe, the green garden could yet be lost in a week, and the garden was not safe yet. The cabbages needed 3 more weeks to head fully. The corn needed the same to fill and dry. The beans were close but not gathered. Everything hung in a balance she did not control, between a flock that wanted to leave and a harvest that was not yet ready, and a valley that was turning, slowly and surely, against her. Then the dry weather broke, but not with rain. It broke with wind, a hot, hard wind out of the southwest that blew for 3 days and stripped the moisture from everything and sent the dust rolling down the valley in brown waves. The wind frightened the birds. They did not like to feed in it, did not like to settle. For 2 whole days, the flock spent more time aloft than down, wheeling and crying, and the worms. The worms loved the heat and went on working unbothered in the soil, while the birds that should have eaten them rode the wind overhead. Adeline stood at her fence on the 3rd evening of the wind, her hair whipping loose, her apron snapping, and she watched fresh holes appear in leaves that had been clean a day before. The bounce was tipping. She could feel it tip, and she did not know how to write it. It was the wind, in the end, that gave Pruitt his opening. He came on the morning the wind finally died, and he did not come alone. 6 men rode up the lane behind him, valley men, men the Mercers had broken bread with and helped at harvest and sat beside in church. They reined up at the fence, and Pruitt sat his mule and looked out over the garden. Still green, though bruised by the wind, the flock thin and restless above it, and his face was the face of a man who has decided he is in the right and means to enjoy it. "Mercer," he called, "we've come to talk sense to you." Caleb came out wiping his hands. Adeline stood in the cabin door, her heart going hard. "The whole valley's lost its gardens," Pruitt said. "Everyone. Children going to go hungry this winter, Caleb. And we got to looking, the men and I, at why. And we kept coming back to those birds. To this." He swept his hand at the garden. "It isn't right. It isn't natural. And we've a notion that flock's been the carrier of whatever blight took the rest of us. That you drew the sickness onto all of us by harboring them. It was nonsense, and some part of every man there likely knew it was nonsense. But it was a story that let them off the hook of their own certainty, and a hungry man will hold to such a story with both hands. "You've got it backward," Caleb said, and his voice was steady though his hands had stilled. "The birds didn't bring the worms. The worms were here first. You all had them, same as us, back in June, before ever a pigeon came. The birds came and ate ours. That's the whole of it. There's no blight, and no sickness, and nothing unnatural but the notion you rode up here carrying." "Then prove it," said one of the Calloway men. "Look at the garden," Caleb said. "There's your proof, green where yours is brown." That's not proof, Pruitt said. That's the very thing that worries us. And the men muttered, and some nodded, and Adeline saw with a sinking heart that Caleb's logic, which was sound, had no purchase on a fear that did not want to be reasoned with. We want the flock gone, Pruitt said. Driven off, today, by you or by us. We'll not have it roosting another night in this valley, spreading what it spreads. We came to ask you to do it, we'd rather you did. He let that sit, but we'll do it ourselves if we must. There it was, the threat under the velvet. Drive off the flock that was the only thing keeping the Mercer garden alive, or have it driven by 7 angry men, with the harvest still 3 weeks from safe. Adeline came down off the step then. She walked to the fence and she faced Pruitt, and she was a small woman and unafraid, and the men shifted in their saddles. You're hungry, she said, all of you, and you're scared for your children, and that's no shame. But you're about to do a foolish thing for a foolish reason, and I won't stand quiet for it. She drew a breath. These birds will leave on their own within the fortnight. They're migrating. They're already half gone. You can see it if you look. Drive them today, and you gain nothing but the satisfaction of it, and you cost me the only garden in this valley that's still alive. The only seed for spring, the only food I might have shared. Shared, Pruitt said, and something flickered in his face. I keep a book, Adeline went on, fast now, pressing the small opening. 3 years of it, every worm and every cure I ever tried. I know what's in your soil because it was in mine. I can show you how I'd have fought it without the birds and how you'll fight it next year, so this never takes you so hard again. But not if you trample my proof into the dirt this morning. It checked them. She saw it check them. But Pruitt's jaw was set, and the men behind him were hungry, and the morning hung on a knife's edge, and then a boy came riding up the lane, hard, shouting, and everything changed. It was the youngest Calloway, no more than 10, and he had been sent to fetch his father. And what he cried out as he came scattered every other thought. The Pruitt place is afire, the dry grass behind the barn. The winds pushed it. It's coming for the corn cribs. The men wheeled their mounts. The fire that had smoldered up out of the brittle wind-killed grass was the valley's true enemy now, and it cared nothing for blame or birds. Pruitt's face went gray. Everything he had left, the seed corn cribbed against winter, the barn, the house, stood in the path of it. And in the confusion, in the shouting and the bolting horses, the flock rose, all of it. 10,000 birds lifting in one vast panicked sheet, wheeling high and streaming away south. Gone. They came back from the Pruitt place near midnight, Adeline and Caleb both, smelling of smoke, their arms aching. The fire was out. The whole valley had fought it. Mercer beside Pruitt, Calloway beside them all, beating at the flames with wet sacks and digging a line until the wind shifted and the danger passed. The seed corn was saved. The barn stood. In the desperate work of it, the morning's quarrel had been forgotten, or at least set down. But the birds were gone, stood at her fence in the dark, and could not see the garden and did not need to. She knew what the morning would show. 3 weeks of worms left unchecked, and the flock that had held them back streaming south over the mountains, not to return. She had told Pruitt the birds would leave within the fortnight. She had not let herself believe it would be tonight, would be now, would be before the harvest was safe. I wrote it in my book, she said, her voice cracking. That we'd eat this winter, I wrote it down. I should never have written it down. Caleb put his arm around her. He smelled of smoke and he was bone-tired, and he did not try to tell her it would. Be all right, because he was not certain it would. We did right by them, he said at last. However it comes out, we didn't drive them. We were good to a strange thing that came to us. He held her in the dark. That counts, even if no one ever knows it. That counts. She did not sleep. She sat at the window with her book open and the lamp low, reading back over 3 years of her own small hand, every worm, every cure, every failure, and what she'd learned from it. And somewhere in the gray before dawn, turning those pages, she understood that the birds had never been the whole of it. The birds had bought her time. But she was the one who had watched, who had written, who had learned the worms better than any soul in the valley. The knowledge was hers. It had always been hers. She stood and woke Caleb and said, "Get the wagon. We've work to do." Morning came clear and still, the wind spent at last, and the valley woke to ash on the air and ruin in the gardens, and, though no one yet knew it, a small woman with a book under her arm climbing into a wagon with a purpose in her jaw. The Mercer garden by daylight was a wounded thing. With the flock gone a single night, the worms had already found their courage. Here and there a fresh hole showed, a beetle worked unbothered. 3 weeks of that, and it would go the way of all the others. Adeline looked at it once, hard, and then she turned her back on it, because she had decided in the night that the garden was no longer the point. The valley was the point. And the valley this morning was beaten and frightened and, for the first time all summer, ready to listen. She went to the Pruitt place first. He was in his yard, gray-faced, surveying the black scar where the grass fire had run nearly to his cribs. He looked up at the wagon, and his expression was wary, braced for triumph, I told you so. For the gloating he would have felt entitled to give in her place. She gave him none of it. "You saved your seed corn last night," she said, climbing down. "Caleb told me. You and he dug the line that turned it." She set her book on the wagon gate and opened it. "I'm not here about the birds. The birds are gone, and they're not coming back this year, and arguing over them now is two fools shouting at an empty sky. I'm here about next year, and the year after, because the worms that took your garden will be in your soil come spring, same as they were this June, and I know how to fight them, and I'll not watch this valley starve twice for want of telling." Pruitt stared at her. "You'd help me," he said slowly, "after yesterday, after I rode up your lane with 6 men. You were hungry and scared," she said. "I said as much yesterday, and I meant it. Now, do we want to know what's in your soil, or do you want to stand here being ashamed? We haven't time for both." Something went out of him then, so some hard knot of pride and fear, and what was left was just a tired farmer who did not want his children to go hungry. He nodded, so she showed him. She knelt in his ruined garden and turned the soil with her hands, and found the grubs where she knew they'd be, in the cool dark under the dead plants, waiting out the season to rise again in spring. She showed him the egg cases on the underside of the few leaves left. She read to him from her book, 3 years of notes, the cures she'd tried before. Ever a bird came, the deep autumn turning of the soil that exposed the grubs to frost and crow, the planting of certain flowers at the row ends that drew the beetles away, the rotation that kept any one pest from settling in, the early planting and the late, the trap rows, the hand-picking in the cool dawn when the worms were slow. None of it was magic. All of it was watching and writing and remembering and being willing to do the patient, unglamorous work that certainty always thought beneath it. Word travels in a beaten valley even faster than in a proud one. By noon there were others at the Pruitt fence, the Callaways, the families from down the creek, drawn by the strange sight of the Pigeon King's wife on her knees in Pruitt's dirt teaching. By afternoon she had moved to the Callaway place, and the crowd had grown, and somewhere in there the thing turned, the way a season turns, all at once, and then all the way. They stopped seeing a witch. They started seeing a neighbor who knew things they needed to know. Hetty Vance came on her cane to watch it, and stood at the back of the crowd, and when Adeline caught her eye, the old woman only smiled and tapped her canekin twice against the ground, which was as much as to say, "There, you see, the truer way." It was Caleb who thought of the seed. He came to find her at the Callaway fence in the late gold afternoon and drew her aside. "Addie," he said, "our garden. It's hurt, but it's not lost. Not yet. There's a fortnight of growing in it still if we tend it close. The cabbages'll head. The beans'll fill. The corn's near dry already." He took her hands. "It won't be the harvest we'd have had, but it'll be more than anyone else in this valley brings in. Enough to share. Enough seed for every family here to plant again come spring." She looked at him. and she understood what he was offering, and what it would cost, and that he was offering it anyway. The one surviving garden in the valley, not hoarded against a hard winter, shared out. All of it, she said. What we don't need to see ourselves through, he said. Seed for everyone. Folks who trampled our melons and called us fools and rode up our lane. He almost smiled, especially them. That's how'd you end a thing like this, not by being right at them, by being good to them till they can't keep up the quarrel. So that is what they did. They tended the wounded garden close through the last weeks of summer, the two of them, doing by hand and care what 10,000 birds had done before, picking the worms in the cool dawns, turning the soil, drawing off the beetles, saving every plant they could. And when the harvest came in, smaller than it would have been but greater than any other in the valley, they did not keep it all. They cleaned the seed and dried it and parceled it out, bean and cabbage and corn, to every family along Spring Creek, with a page copied from Adeline's book folded in with each share, the cures, the rotations, the patient watching way of it, so that no one need depend on a passing miracle of birds ever again. Pruitt came for his share himself. He stood on the mercer's step a long moment, turning his hat in his hands, and the apology he could not quite shape into words was plain enough on his face. Adeline put the seed into his hands and the page on top of it. "Plant it in good time," she said, "and turn your soil deep this fall. I've written you the rest." He nodded. At the wagon, he turned back. "The Pigeon King," he said, and now it was not a sneer but something near to wonder. "I reckon we owe him an apology, and you the bigger one." "Plant the seed," she said. "That's apology enough." The next spring came green up and down Spring Creek. Adeline stood at her fence in the soft April light and looked out over a valley of gardens, her own, and the Pruitts, and the Callaways, and all the rest. Every one of them turned and planted in good time. Flowers at the row ends to draw the beetles, the soil broken deep against the frost. No flock darkened the sky. None was needed now. The valley had learned to do for itself the patient work the birds had once done for it. Hetty Vance came up the lane on her cane, slow and smiling, and stood beside her at the fence. "You read the land right after all," the old woman said. "No," said Adeline, watching the green come up. "I just watched it, and believed what it did."